From the Post Building in downtown North St. Louis, this is Inside City. Tosha Downey, welcome to Inside City. Thank you for giving me a few minutes today.
Thank you for having me.
So I listened to your TED Talk from about 7 years ago.
Okay.
And I know you've done quite a bit since then, but you've got a really compelling story of having grown up in poverty, father in the military and
Yeah.
whatnot. And so I think I'd like to start with you telling that story, and
Yeah.
probably often told story, I would guess.
Yeah. In the context, right, in the context of the TED Talk, it really was just kind of this idea, coupled with this work that I do. I do work that's centered on education policy. At the time, I was at the Memphis Education Fund. Now I'm at the Gates Foundation. And part of that narrative is that I work in philanthropy. I do huge investments to advance good, right? And one of the things that we were underscoring for a long time is just this idea that there are many policies that make it hard for families to
Right.
escape poverty. And so that was quintessentially my story. And there's the narrative often that, well, you did it. And I was like, yeah, but I was truly, truly exceptional. And there were lots of components to that, right?
Yeah,
That I had a
lot of
young mom,
barriers
right?
that-
I had a young mother, young parents who had known each other since childhood.
Mhm.
And my mom was pregnant at the time my dad went away to the military, and my mother got terribly ill and suffered from severe postpartum psychosis
Mhm.
and had a severe mental break in the first year of my life. And my dad had to make the decision of, am I going to stay in the military and continue building a life for us, or am I going to go home and take care of my girlfriend at the time and this new baby that we have? And so my dad was like, I need to take a leave, and the military was like, well, you can't. He's like, well, I'm leaving anyway.
I see.
And was subsequently, my dad was court-martialed and reprimanded and a whole host of other things. But at the core was my parents were trying to figure out how they were going to take care of little me.
Yeah.
And I like to say our life was all centered in Memphis. So I don't think I said that, but I'm from Memphis.
Yeah.
And a life that I say is lived on 3 blocks. Like today, my dad is deceased now, but my parents live in a house that's 3 blocks from the house in the 1-bedroom apartment where I was born. Spent our whole life there in the poorest zip code, in the poorest census tract in the city of Memphis. And, from the time he left the military to the time he passed away or went out on medical disability, my father worked a low-wage, blue-collar job, but was a pillar of our community. And my mom struggled, with her mental illness,
Mhm.
but also maintained this place in the community where, if people needed food, if people needed a place, if people needed supports, that those 2 people, my mom and my dad, would be there to provide that. But
Even though they didn't have much
and
for
didn't have
themselves.
much. And
Yeah,
so
they still would.
so a big part of my story when I went to Gates, a big part of my story was, if we can do philanthropy from a position of lack, of financial lack, because what I always like to say is, I grew up in poverty. That meant there were lack of economic resources.
Mhm.
But everybody on our block, people were generous and giving and caring and supportive in a way that allowed us to maintain, even through, the crack epidemic and disinvestment in the community, and now a shell of a community that most people who grew up there wouldn't even recognize, that, all the buildings have been,
So
razed and
it's gotten worse since
desolate.
you
Yeah.
know.
My mom and our former neighbor who recently passed are the only 2 houses on our block
Wow.
in that community. Literally every house has been either abandoned or torn down. Families have moved away because many of them could, or had better economic opportunity and had a chance to move away, and they did.
And I think in that TED Talk, you talked about the number of people who are able to escape poverty from that
Right.
is a very low number. It's, I think,
Yeah.
if I'm remembering right,
Like
23%
23%
that are
children
able to do it, which means 3/4 are not.
are not.
And you had talked a little bit about some of it is because of family, that they're there, they don't want to leave.
Yeah.
Um, grandparents or extended family, as well as then, and we talk a little bit about this, the policies that are in place, and you
Yeah.
outlined how all these from your father being dishonorably discharged because of a policy issue or um, inability to get access to health care or different things.
Yeah.
And so that has spurred you, though, to become involved in policy issues
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
Bill and Melinda Gates
Yeah.
Foundation, and specifically, I think, with Tennessee.
Yeah.
So, talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I tell people two things about policy. Public policy is my love language. I was like, policy is my love language.
Uh-huh.
I'm not as wonky as most people would believe because I went to policy school at the University of Michigan, so we're known to be a pretty wonky school. We can quantify anything
Mhm.
at the University of Michigan School of Policy, but so that's one part that I'm a trained public policy professional. But that the other part of that is that my lived experiences really are the undercurrent for public policy. And so I say to people often that most of our private choices are influenced by public policy,
Sure.
right? And so when whatever the narrative or whatever the
Right.
conversation ends up being, if we're talking about access to healthcare, well, trust me, there's a
Right.
policy somewhere that's impeding my
Well,
ability to get quality mental health care. Or
the policies
yeah,
set the boundaries, or
yeah,
the sandbox you're going to play in is set by those policies. And so ultimately, you may think, "Oh, I
exactly.
have choices or whatever," but you're really within the boundaries of the maybe without most people even realizing that.
I think most people don't. It's like
Right.
it's the air, right? It's the
Right.
fish who's like water. What's water,
What's water,
right?
right? Yeah.
And so, literally, every role, most of the roles that I had that weren't direct service, I spent a lot of time in public education. Was in Chicago, worked in one of the first charter schools to be open there. Then went to law school, came back to work on college access and workforce with young people, working with both a nonprofit organization, but also with the city of Chicago to try to make sure that young people had access to opportunities for employment and for education beyond school time. So that was a big part of that. And then when I had the opportunity to come back to Memphis to work for the Memphis Education Fund, it was both in an education role, but also in a policy role, in a philanthropic role to fund public policy, both at the district level and at the state level, mostly focus around making sure that funding is more equitable,
Mhm.
making sure that students have access to quality post-secondary opportunities, because like those were I would say those are the levers
Mhm.
that made it possible for there to be opportunities for kids like me, for the strivers of
I
us.
see.
And so the work that I do, I mean, literally somebody tapped me on my shoulder and said, "Hey, there's this great opportunity that the Gates Foundation has had a long history in Tennessee since 2008, but had done a huge investment in Memphis to grow and improve the quality of teachers through a $90 million investment there. And then fast forward in around the 2021 year,
Mhm.
someone said, well, there's going to be a new focus, not a new focus, but a transformed focus
Mhm.
that Gates is going to pay attention to Tennessee in a very few areas, right? Focused on making sure there's funding equity both at the elementary and at the K-12 and the um, post-secondary levels, but then also again pushing for improvements in access on the way to college and making sure that college is affordable. So those policy priorities are like, wait. That's easy because that's stuff that I'm deeply passionate and deeply committed to. And it's stuff that the great state of Tennessee, I always tell people, don't fight my state because it's so red. But
Mhm.
it's the state that has historically been able to be really smart and progressive on education issues. And so, so our investments in policy when I was locally in Memphis and now kind of in a, multinational policy capacity at Gates, that's what we've been able to do, really support a lot of what has already been happening
Mhm.
in the state and partnering with organizations to serving families directly in communities across Tennessee.
So you're here in St. Louis for a conference, and
Yeah.
ABFE, Association of Black Foundation Executives, is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about why you're here in St. Louis and
Yep.
what this conference is about.
Okay. So the AbbVie is what we affectionately call it, the Association of Black Foundation Executives, was founded in the late 70s when, of course, after several large philanthropic organizations had opened opportunities to Black professionals, Ford Foundation, Kellogg, some others. and Gates wasn't even a twinkle in anybody's eye back
Right.
then.
Yeah.
We weren't even a twinkle in the eye, but that there was just a space of emerging Black professionals in philanthropy, and that there was no place or space where you would learn kind of the core skills. I mean,
Mhm.
like, who among us has gone to undergraduate school thinking, "Oh, I want to work in philanthropy, right? I want to
Right.
work at a foundation." I mean, now people may, but then most people didn't even know it was an
Especially for
opportunity, right?
people of color, right?
Especially for
Yeah.
people of color. And so this, late 70s, it's like, hey, we should probably create a space where young Black professionals who are working in this industry are learning the skills, have a community, are able to network. And actually, I say a big part of my ability to stay in the philanthropy space is the connection to other Black professionals
Mhm.
across the country. And so every year, they do a big event called Harambe, which is the annual conference. And this year, there are about 800 folks who will be attending that conference here in St. Louis. And each year, we pick a different city. Last year was in Raleigh, Durham. 2 years post-pandemic, it was in Washington, D.C. It's been held in Memphis in other cities. And, a big part of them bringing the conference to a city is to really do a little bit of a deep dive. And so
Mhm.
this year there will be a celebration of the Ferguson
Sure.
incidents and Michael Brown and what that life and legacy has been and what the impact it has on how we give, why we give, and how we do our work as philanthropy professionals. And I also have a special little cog in the wheel, and why there's what I'd like to say a special piece of magic of this was there's an opportunity for all of us to present as any conference would be.
Mhm.
And so there's a group of about four of us, three from Memphis, two from Memphis, and then one from Charlotte, North Carolina. We'll be presenting on a panel on Saturday talking about the value proposition of life in the American South as a
Mhm.
as a Black professional, like reimagining what the effects of the Great Migration of our grandparents and our great
Mhm.
grandparents in a time of what many will say the height of racial terror in the American South, and now an opportunity to see that reimagined in the opportunities for both political power and economic power. As we're watching the coasts be out of reach for financial progress and
Mhm.
the ability to build wealth, to raise a family, just because of sheer accessibility of living.
And in terms of that, it's geared towards foundation executives, but who would be the type of person who would be
Yeah,
interested or attend
yeah.
beyond maybe the people who are running these organizations?
Literally, it is. I think foundation. We have not. The name has not evolved
I see.
from the original time,
I
but
see.
it is almost people who are working in as
Philanthropy. I
intermediaries and
see.
philanthropy and corporate giving officers, social responsibility officers at organizations. I mean, there are small family funds. I mean, I've even met folks who are a part of like community giving circles.
Mhm.
Again, just like that spirit of philanthropy. I was like, in another world, if my father were here, I'd be like, Dad, you should be at this. Like understanding the power of what it means to
Sounds
be a
like
giver.
your parents were both role models that although they didn't have much, they gave
Yeah.
back to the community that they had, and that obviously from your growing up, that's influenced your decisions to go into public policy then.
It has. It's John, it's one of those things where I think because we've made, I guess, the marker of success and the marker of achievement
Mhm.
financial, right? The way we keep score
Right.
is how much money we have, how big our house
Yeah,
is,
it's a very
how
American.
nice our
No,
how
no,
nice,
it's a
right?
very American thing in
how
this
how
at this
nice
point
our
in
car,
time.
how
Yeah,
nice
yeah.
our cars are.
Right.
But when we look at, places where people live the longest, where they thrive, it is because they live in community.
Right.
It's interwoven. They have reasonably good access to food, family, and community.
Right.
And I think for somehow, maybe that's the roots my mom brought from, her
Yeah.
birth and life and upbringing as a small child in Mississippi. And my grandmother was a sharecropper. And, what we know is that even in the most difficult of circumstances, what people do is rely on each other.
Right.
So I like in my heart, in my work, in my practice, I can't get away from it, if I want to. So
Yeah, in this digital age, it's I think the phrase is you have connections but not community. In
That's
other
right.
words, from the electronics and looking into the phone and whatnot, and people tend to retreat into the electronics, and that the connection is not the same as community.
Right.
And that's what you're really working toward.
Yeah. I mean, and it's one of these things, like even in big spaces, like at Gates, we are 2,000, I think we're about 2,300 employees
Wow.
across, I think we're adding two new offices. So somewhere between 11 and 13 offices worldwide. And I always say when I'm in the office, I'm based in the DC office. And I always say to my colleagues, like, if you lived in a small town of 2,000 people, you'd
Mhm.
know everybody.
Right.
Right. And so in our workspaces, in the places where we go to school, it baffles me that we aren't more intentional about knowing each other. Like that's how you bridge gaps, right? Like
Yeah.
that's how you make the work. I believe you make the work better
Mhm.
when you have better relationships as well. So
So you've got it both at the federal level, the
yeah,
state level, and the city level, or the where policies tend to get set. It could
yeah,
be, everything from zoning. Zoning is policy of what can
absolutely.
be built and whatnot, and where it can be built. And St. Louis has a regrettable history with, I think they call it
Redlining.
redlining,
Hmm.
where certain areas of the city people of color could live and couldn't live, and that a lot of that is either implicit or explicit, but policy tends to be more explicit. And then you've got the state um, things, which sounds like you're doing a lot in Tennessee. We have, here in Missouri, and then you've got the federal. In a lot of ways, people feel like our institutions are broken right now. If you look at healthcare, you look at public education, you look at federal government, they're very inefficient, and that I don't know that they're any more broken than they ever have been, but that
Yeah,
is
their
certainly
perception. Yeah,
that's certainly the narrative right now.
right.
So if you could speak to how what you're doing at the Gates Foundation, and but previous work too, of
Yeah.
the role of private philanthropy in helping those systems work better.
Yeah.
That kind of a long
Yeah.
roundabout way
No,
of
it's the way that it's a thoughtful question, that the way that I always frame the work is that the role of philanthropy is to catalyze activity, is to lift up proof points and prove what's the power of what's possible. There are programs that exist in the state of Tennessee in particular. There's a small county, Greene County, at the tip of Tennessee and Virginia, where there's one middle school math teacher across the
Mhm.
district, right? And there's
and
zero,
and they're making a ton of money doing that,
and they're
right?
making a
Yeah, right.
boatload of money.
Yeah, right.
And there's one AP math
For an entire
teacher
for an
for the
entire
whole
district.
county,
Yeah.
right? And the proof point that the Nicewanger Foundation, an organization we work with, one of the leaders and director of that, was like, I believe that if we could support the development and training of more teachers to teach AP, we can digitize or make
Mm.
virtual AP access here in this county. Well, once we could prove, hey, they could do that, philanthropy invested in that because the district and the county had no resources to pay for that expansion of opportunity. The training of the teachers, the district had no resources to
Mhm.
do that. Philanthropy could.
I see.
And then what philanthropy did was elevate the county then had a proof point to take to the legislature. And now we have APS when the
Mhm.
pandemic hits. Imagine this, right? There is an opportunity to do AP access for students all across all 95 counties in the state of Tennessee, where many of those students, if they're outside of a big metro, they wouldn't have any access. And so that is now a policy with a line item in a governor's budget.
And so you've mentioned you're from Memphis and that area, but
Yeah.
I guess in your work, then you look at the entire state and not just, or do you tend to focus more on urban programs?
Yeah, 95 counties. Tennessee is 95 counties, six large metropolitan school districts, and 40, I think it's 141 districts across the state.
Mhm.
And so, what we see, just our learned and lived experience, like the difference is primarily it's density versus scarcity and sparsity.
Mhm.
But providing the same levels of opportunity, like some of the best exemplars. One of our most exemplary programs for college persistence was founded in little bitty Parsons, Tennessee.
Hmm.
And, another philanthropic partner, the Ayers Family Foundation, had committed to supporting guidance counselors in rural counties in West and Middle Tennessee. And now, so that, they start in a 5-county radius. They're now in 45 counties.
Wow.
And they also now have kind of illustrated what we need to do to ensure that students from rural and distressed counties need to thrive is they need the counselor support, and they need their teachers trained differently around helping them be counseled and advised toward college opportunity. Well, now that
Or the
exemplar has been elevated to the, to the
Mhm.
legislature, and there's a line item for those supports for students across rural counties, all across the state.
So, I mean, in terms of your ability to beat the odds and
Yeah.
not only escape poverty, but then to make it a mission to help others along, because there are people who just um, don't necessarily have the same ability either to do what you've done or the same imperative to go back. I mean, what would you attribute that to?
My mama would whoop me if I did. Like,
Okay, all
in
right.
the truest sense, my mama would whoop me if I didn't.
Okay.
But it really was. I remember a time I was home, just by way of story. I remember being home once from college. Probably may have been my first year, and somebody, one of the people in my neighborhood, who had really started. I mean, I'd known them from the time I was a child, but really
Mhm.
started a real severe battle with
Decline.
drug and
Hmm.
decline,
Hmm.
right? And I remember them coming to my house and coming to our house. And I was like, well, Dad, why don't let them in? And my father said to me, he was like, don't ever get above
Hmm.
where you are from and who you are. You never get to be above people. And I was like, okay,
Yeah.
right? And literally from that day to this one, like I don't need a reminder that
Hmm.
but for grace, like I've known that person my whole life, in life in just a different set of life circumstances and befell them. And what I realized is like I was just kind of a beloved kid, right? Like
Hmm.
I tell people like all the old ladies in the neighborhood, like if I was not next door with the Hayes and their 6 kids, I was across the street with Miss Jordan or across the street with Miss Green or down the block with Miss Willa Mae. I mean, everybody always kind of had their eyes on me, they had their hands on me, and I would almost say they always had their prayers on me. And so it kind of makes you very sympathetic to the reality that everybody just does not have that, right?
Hmm.
And also that I had parents who were willing to, as I like to say, who were not afraid to like share their child and say, no, this is a child of a village, and that everybody in this village is invested in this child. And so kind of like, I see my role and my purpose is kind of like, how do we recreate those villages? Even in, as society has morphed and changed, and even in my own neighborhood where people who once they've had the means, they've moved away. And so the little kids who live next door were 6 and 7, my parents were elderly, right? So they were their neighbors. But how do we recreate that? And how do we recreate that in systemic ways, in ways that can be scaled, right? And a lot of that is through our policies.
Oh, that's a great story.
Yeah.
And you were receptive to it. You had both the sensitivity to accept it, but then the grit to all the hard work to go and then understanding to come back. It's terrific.
Yeah. One of the things I kind of say too is like that, that one incident with my dad. And I just, in my head, I thought, I just never know how, you never know how life turns out.
Right.
Because, even my mom, like my mom is smart and industrious and hardworking. And post childbirth,
Yeah.
your mind says something completely different
Hmm.
about who you are, what you will be, and how to function in the society around you. And fortunately for her, my grandmother, my aunts, like everybody could rally around her,
Hmm.
support her, and support me in a way that allowed us to sustain. But I think about a young mom who doesn't have access to good
Right.
health care,
The
a
support
close
network.
family,
Right.
and you're struggling with, with a postpartum psychosis or an episode, then your life and the life of your very young child goes in a very different direction.
Well, we just assume that our mental and physical health is gonna be there
We
for
get to
us,
take it for
and we
granted. We
take it for
really
granted,
do.
right? As well
We
as,
really do.
not everybody has the same support network of family, friends, stable job, access to healthcare, health, all that. And if
Right.
you start to lose those, then you can find, as you said, no, you just don't know how things are gonna be presented or where life's gonna take you.
Yeah.
So so there's both St. Louis and Memphis are river cities, and
Yeah.
in some ways they're very unique, but in some ways there are similarities
Yeah.
too. And we've got good parts of the city and parts that struggle a little bit more. Are there lessons that you've learned there that we can take and bring to this city?
Yeah. I was as I was coming in, I was just like, I love the commitment. I love
Hmm.
St. Louis is the same kind of grit, tenacity, and commitment that
Hmm.
Memphis has. Like we have a new mayor, young mayor, young mayor who, had worked, in city government and downtown was the downtown Memphis commission chair, like committing to coming and staying
Hmm.
and reinvesting. Like my perpetual cry is we have to reinvest in the city. We have to reinvest in communities that our best strategy can't be to retreat to the farthest ends of our cities or our counties and avoid the problems and look away
Right.
because that way the problems never get to be ours. And I think that, I have several friends who are like, high earning, young, upwardly mobile, and they have said, I am going to live in the city. I'm
Mhm.
going to live in downtown. I'm going to spend my money in the core of the city.
Yeah.
That creates jobs, that creates the interest for folks for there to be a thriving downtown and inner city, and that grows out city community. And so I think Memphis is struggling with that. I mean, I think post pandemic, we are one of the few cities that have not seen our crime levels go down post pandemic, and so the city is struggling with that.
Mhm.
But I will continue to go back to, especially because you're talking about high incidence of youth involved crime is what we're seeing. I will go back to investment. Where is our investment? And I think Memphis is now trying to figure out how to make some of those investments in young people that gives them a hope for a better future, two, something to do with youthful energy that has to be spent somewhere and is usually spent in mischievous ways.
Yeah, right.
And two, getting the prior generations convinced that all is not lost, right? Because I think, it feels like every generation forgets that, well, you were in the generation
Yeah,
that the
right.
generation ahead of you
Yeah.
talked about as being hopeless, right?
Right, right. We
So
sound more and more like our parents
we
every day,
do. We
it's,
do.
and each generation has those problems. So
Yeah.
the 80s crack epidemic
Yeah.
is one, and or gangs or different things,
Yeah.
and each one has to struggle to overcome those.
Yeah, I mean, and some of it is right. I mean, I grew up in this season, and I look at many of the young people who went to high school with me or that I knew from other cities. I worked a lot in Chicago. I had lots of friends in Chicago growing up as a young person, and I'm looking at all of them who navigated these really tough terrains, and they are thriving adults, but most of them have lives that are so busy. It's like, are you mentoring? Are you giving back? Are you spending
Yeah.
time with a young person? Because I also think that is what is that's one of the things that's missing. People are like, oh, it's there's single parent homes, and I was like, well, there were some single moms on my street too, but there
Mhm.
were also other families that people could connect to. There was, we would Miss Johnson. She had 5 kids, but there would be like 20 kids in that house on any given day because
Yeah.
all the kids would be hanging out there. We're all eating popcorn, we're all just watching TV, watching movies. And I think that for a lot of young people, those safe spaces don't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The technology, as I was saying earlier, is just
You're
unfortunately
right.
it allows people to become very
Yeah.
isolated, and
Yeah.
that's not a great spot to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and because you have 5,000 friends on Facebook or 5,000
Right.
followers, it gives
Well,
you a false sense
it
of
does. It gives you
how
a false
connected
sense
you actually
of
are
community, but at the
to
same time,
people. That's
it
right.
can be very isolating as
Yes.
well.
Yeah.
And you don't have that human interaction. And in a lot of ways, I think I won't say that technology is a fantasy, but because I sit there and think, how do you have a hard conversation with somebody? It's much easier to do it via text, or you can
Yeah.
just punch out, and you don't. And our kids may not be as well equipped to do those things because they haven't been exposed to it.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's some great things about technology too that
Yeah.
allows you to connect with people regardless of geography,
Yep.
and that can be very wonderful and powerful. So it's definitely a two-edged sword.
Yeah.
So
But it's, what I also find is that adults struggle to connect with young people even when they're physically present.
right,
It's so and it's almost like I don't know how, so
right,
I'm afraid to.
sure,
I watch my friends with their children. It's like
yeah,
there are five of us in a room, and it's okay for you to let your young person to just be on a device and not be engaged in the
right,
conversation when that is an opportunity. As I always tell young people, like if your phone is desired, then I I'm opting to spend time in
yeah,
community with people. And so just being able to name that the gift of our presence is
hmm,
worth investing in.
right,
And I think young people are surprised
yeah,
when an adult tries to actually engage them and
yeah, right,
find out what's going on in their life and find out what's interesting to them and awkwardly, do some weird TikTok dance, but
right.
it helps young people know that we are invested in them in ways that they just expect
Um,
us not to be.
is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we haven't
No,
talked
I
about
I
now?
I want you to give me the secrets. All I can take back to
Well,
Memphis from St.
yeah, I mean, I guess
Memphis
there's
and Nashville and Knoxville and Chattanooga.
no, right.
How do we get it?
No,
How do we get it right down
well,
the
I mean, all
river?
these urban areas are, I think in a lot of ways we had these issues before COVID, but then it just sort of
Yeah,
opened up that, wow, we really do
yeah,
have them quite a bit, and the disparity between the two, in particular in urban areas, but rural areas too.
yeah,
And in a lot of ways, I guess my thought is it probably just gets back to, we always want a big thing or a silver bullet, but it is, I think, blocking and tackling in those small things. And so, to the degree that you are able to move dollars or do policy that influence success, I think is how it's done. And the
yeah,
problems do evolve and change over time, and what worked before doesn't work again. And um, but it's the hard work, right? That and
yeah.
and being attentive and those types of things.
Yeah. And I think I always tell people like, grace is a big thing for me, right?
Yeah,
Like leading with grace and assuming good intention when
yeah,
folk are trying to work, we may be in opposition, but we usually are trying to get to the same
right,
good thing and good outcome,
right.
right? And kind of helping people to like, how do we just develop a capacity to listen? Two governors, Republican Governor
Hmm.
Haslam and Democratic Governor Bredesen, they have a podcast. And one of the things they always say is like, hey, the other guy might be right. Or
Hmm.
the other girl might be right.
Hmm.
And just thinking about, kind of your deep commitments to what you know or feel is the right way to do it. Just kind of asking yourself, hey, what if
Right.
the other side is right? And taking cues to
Well,
move that
especially
way.
in policy and where laws are
Yeah.
made, that it is about compromise, and you
Yeah.
don't get everything you want, and you can't be so single-minded in your approach.
I said that was our life in Tennessee for a long, long time. It's
Yeah.
like, how did we get here? It's like
Yeah.
we were middle of the road
Yeah.
state on both Republicans and Dem sides. So
Yeah.
I'm always hopeful. The pendulum will swing
It always does.
back to
Yeah.
a place of reasonability
Let's
and
hope so.
not polarization. It will.
Tasha, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming
Great.
by.
Thank you for having me, John.